So I'm going to hand over the purpose and agenda to Dr. Thomas for this meeting.
Thank you, Vice Chair Franz. Tonight, we have our work session. Work session's purpose is to engage with our board, to also engage with our community around topics that will eventually come your way for votes or key decision making. And tonight we have some heavier conversations with you all. We have our enrollment update. We have our preliminary budget discussion with the board. We are also going to be forecasting some of the legislative costing and impact update that we know that the omnibus bills just were released, just hot off the press about an hour or so ago. We'll also have a staffing update and projections that we see. A couple of proclamations, and then we'll also be talking about Policy 606 tonight with some of the reviews and changing of protocols to shore up that policy and regulations. And we are also going to talk about our crisis management policy with the board. And then we have a second read of student medication, no changes there. And that will conclude our work session agenda for the board this evening. I turn it back to you, Vice Chair Franz.
Okay, so the next item is just to remind everybody of our district governance and policy, which is the primary working documents of all of our study sessions. In the study session book, you'll see the areas highlighted that we actually are covering in this meeting. That include the policy as well as the oversight and budget operations. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Oversight and Operations for Executive Director of Business Services, Tammy Fredrickson.
Thank you, Vice Chair Franz, Superintendent, members of the board. I've supplied you with a few documents tonight, the first one being the enrollment update. So as we are getting closer to June and getting that final budget presented to the board, we are keeping a very close eye on our enrollment projections. And as you recall at our last meeting, when we talked about what our enrollment projections would look like, we were building a revenue and expense budget based on enrollment of about 8,600 kids. And as of March 17th, we currently have 8,400 kids enrolled. We again have enrollment still happening. There will continue through the next couple months and over the summer. And so we're still hopeful that we will see that 8,600 student mark. If we do not get that, then our revenue and expense projections that we are presenting tonight are going to have to be adjusted, and we will continue to have those conversations. I will take any questions on the enrollment.
Does anybody have any questions? I have one, Tammy. I know that in previous years, we've watched the kindergarten open enrollment and everyone that's enrolling, and we tend to, it tend to really hits a peak sometime over the summer, not just when we open it online. Did you by any chance take a look at the previous patterns of enrollment and just see whether, at what point we need to adjust the budget? Because it may be after June 30th.
Yeah, and we have that opportunity. If we need to adjust the budget, we can always come back with a budget amendment. And we will certainly keep a very close eye on that, just to make sure that if our enrollment doesn't come in at what we think we are in September, then we'll want to adjust some of our spending plans. So we'll need to continue to monitor that throughout the summer and then make any of those adjustments right away as we need to. So if we in fact do need to do an amendment to the budget, we'll bring that as soon as we know.
Anybody else have any questions?
Just one clarifying question. Tammy, is the open enrolled numbers, that line item, is that part of the total above
Yes,
it?
It is.
Okay. Thank you.
Is it typical that we are 200 and some off of our projection at this time of the year?
Historically, yes, we see less than, there's still families that are making decisions, and we try to make sure that any of those families that are asking for open enrollment, that we're accommodating them. We have space in our building, so we thought it would be very prudent to let the families that want to open enroll to do that. You know, if we didn't, we'd be down even more kids. So we've honored all of the open enrollment that we had so far, and we anticipate there will be more. And then, you know, there's other districts around us that may have some challenges that we would see some other open enrolled students.
Tammy, with the open enrollment of 118 students, how does that compare to years past? Do you have a comparison of how this compares to last year?
I don't have it with me tonight. I can get that to you.
Share with the board too, conversation I was having with the senior team the other day is what are our proactive efforts in reaching out to our current families in our district, particularly our incoming kindergarten families, whether it's telephone trees, door knocking campaigns. You know, we need to make sure that we are essentially promoting PLSAS. This is the place to be. And we can't, in this day and age, where choice, you know, in the K-12, you know, sphere is infinite, right? Whether they charter, private, home, other districts, we, like any other industry, have to compete. And, you know, part of our efforts as a team is to bring together strategies that are probably a little bit more new for us because for the past several years, we've been in this decline, and so historically, we've not had to face this kind of a reality. But before it gets, you know, completely out of hand, we want to be proactive. And so part of that is making sure we're making those direct connections. We'll be coming to the board in April, as I shared last month, or our last business meeting, with the reports on our Morris Leatherman survey, and those are data that will inform us on those who are not choosing our district. But as I stated, there's far more choosing us than leaving us. And so we can't take it for granted that they'll just choose us by default. We have to make sure that we are proactive in our efforts. So that's another piece that we're working on as a senior team.
I have another question, if it's okay. I know that we also have an updated census or population projection going on, and a lot of areas are dropping for 18 and younger. Was that included in our enrollment prediction?
Yes, we looked at the birth rates in the surrounding area. The birth rates are declining, and that's usually the indicator of in 5 years what your kindergarten will look like. Well, the last at least 3 years, the birth rate has gone down quite a bit. We also look at if there's any charter schools opening or closing. We only have one in our district, but if there's others that may open or close, we look at if there's any housing either being built, if it's single-family homes, if it's multi-family housing, whatever it is. So all of that kind of goes into looking at what your enrollment's going to look like in the future.
Any other questions before we move on?
Amy, when do we typically see kind of that influx of, or parents making the decision on where they're going to send their children? Is it typically towards the middle or end of summer? Or?
In my experience, it's usually kind of in the middle of the summer,
Okay.
as they start planning. Oh, we got school starting pretty soon. Then, if you haven't made a decision, then you have to pretty quickly. So, we will see. Again, it's if we can do some marketing, then maybe we can advance that timeline.
And then thinking forward to the 24-25 school year as we start the budget planning for that. I imagine these numbers will also impact any future projections.
Correct.
So what's kind of that drop dead date for when we just kind of freeze that data and start projecting forward for that budget process?
Well, we have to have a approved budget by June 30th. So up until that first board meeting in June, we can make any adjustments that we need to. After that, then once it's kind of finalized, then we submit that to Department of Education, and then from there it becomes, you need to do a budget amendment or whatever changes you need to make.
Anybody else?
The next document that I have on here is the revenue detail. Again, you've seen this before. It just breaks out all of our state aid and the levy dollars that we get. In the top part of the report, it is assuming a 2% increase on the formula allowance, which is what it currently is in statute. And then at the bottom of the report, I added what it would look like if there was a 4% formula increase, which is what the governor and the House have looked at, and then a 5% increase that the Senate had been looking at, a 5%. So I just added those numbers on there so you could see the comparative of what the difference would look like if the legislature changes the formula allowance. So then the next report on there is the budget scenarios. So up on the top left-hand corner, for this last year, 21-22 school year, based on our audited numbers, our actual revenue came in at $113.5 million. Our actual expenses were $107.8 million, which means that we added $5.8 million to our fund balance last year. And again, you've all seen that when the auditors came in and did that presentation. For this current year, 22-23, our estimated revenue is $111.6 million. Again, you saw that when we did the budget amendment in December. Our estimated expense is going to be at about $110.7 million. So we are looking like we're pretty close to what we anticipated. We could add the fund balance by about $800,000 if this comes in the way it is. And again, we monitor that. You see the financial statements every month in your board packet. So we'll continue to monitor that as the year goes on and make any adjustments that we need to. So then what I did was, if you assume 2% on the formula allowance, which is current statute, 4% increase, which is one of the proposals, or a 5% increase, which again is another proposal. We don't know yet what it's going to look like because the legislature hasn't finished their work. On the first column, I'm assuming a 3% increase in our expenses. In the next column, I'm assuming a 5% increase in expenses, and then a 7%, and then a 9% increase. I don't think that 3% is enough. If you look at utility costs right now, they're going up about 8%. We've already heard from some of our transportation companies that although we do have a contract for the next year, that costs are going up about 6 to 8% for them. There's still supply chain issues. There's still contracts that are being increased. There's just everything that kind of comes in is costing more money. So I don't think a 3% is reasonable. We also have to remember that we have our salaries that we've already settled in our contracts, and then we also have the teacher's contract that we haven't settled yet. So there are a multitude of things that are possibilities. We have to kind of make plans for A, B, C, and D. So I'm just presenting all these different scenarios. But as you can see on each one of them, our expenses are going to exceed what our revenue projections look like. Now, having said that, we are sitting in a pretty good spot right now compared to some of the other districts because we did have $5.8 million added to fund balance. And that was due mainly to a lot of vacant positions that we were not able to fill. So we had significant salary savings in 21-22. And as we were planning the 22-23 budget last spring, there was also an anticipation of exceeding, expenses exceeding revenue. So there was some planned use of fund balance, which again, I don't think is going to happen this year. So we actually have some opportunities to look at some other options as we move forward. There are risks to that, and I just want the board to be aware that we don't know what's happening at the legislature right now. We don't know what some of these expenses are going to look like. We don't know what the inflation factor is going to look like in their economy. So there's a lot of things that are at risk at any of these scenarios. So I just want to have a conversation tonight how comfortable you feel with some of these different scenarios and if there's any questions that I can help answer.
I have a question really quick, just to get a baseline. In previous years, we've had an issue with not having all staff hired that was open positions. In order to just understand the baseline of these expenses, are we assuming we're going to have all positions filled?
No, we did not. We looked at how many vacant positions we currently have and then took that as a factor. I think we're doing much better, but there are some very hard to fill positions that have been hard to fill for the last couple of years. So there is some of that baked in here, not to the extent that we have for the last 2 years, but there is some baked in.
So it would be safe to assume that the baseline expenses would be higher if we were able to fill all the positions?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Start with questions. Ready?
One question I have is, with the teacher's contract not yet being settled, is there typically do we have some idea of what that might look like as far as their increase or?
So that will be a conversation that we'll have as we do some of that planning with the board. We haven't yet had those conversations. We're still trying to settle all the ones from this year.
And so we really don't have an idea of what that might look like.
Not at this time, Amy,
Yeah.
and similar to what we've done in the past, when we get closer to that and we also see some of the final numbers coming in, we'll engage the board in a work session to understand the parameters. You all will set the parameters for us to go into negotiate, and we'll provide you the resources and forecast for you to kind of make those decisions. But then that's the parameters that we take then into negotiations as we've done with all of our employee groups to date. We've not wavered from those parameters.
So Tammy, these are super helpful to see the what-if scenarios, because like you said, we don't know where the legislatures are gonna land. And so just to clarify, the 5.8 million that you mentioned, that's part of the 22.2 million fund balance that we have currently? Is that correct, or is there an additional 5.8?
No, that
That's
was
total.
what we added to fund balance from the last year's audit.
So, okay, so do we feel, like, how are you feeling about the 22 million fund balance going into this budgeting process? Does that look like about the same? No, 22.2, where we were at last, I pulled up last month's.
Yeah, so
board
the
meetings.
total fund balance, which includes non-spendable, restricted, signed, and unassigned, is the 22 million. Our unassigned fund balance is 11.3 million.
Unassigned is 11.3.
Correct.
And the total, which is assigned and unassigned, is 22.2 million.
Correct. That also includes restricted and non-spendable. And the restricted, we can't spend for anything other than what was restricted for.
Okay.
But even in the worst-case scenario, so if we assume a 2% increase on the formula and a 9% in expenses, that highest one currently sitting at about 10.5% fund balance in our unassigned fund balance, which our board policy is 8 to 13. If we assumed a 9% increase instead of 10.5, we would be about down to 9.3 or 9.4. So we'll still be within the parameters that you've set as a board.
What are the risks, Tammy, of dipping into that when and if?
It's one-time money. It's, once you spend it, it's gone. So as we move forward, we would have to take that in consideration, that we're increasing our expenses at a rate that we would not be able to sustain given these parameters. So the legislature could do something different. We could add enrollment. There's a lot of other things that could happen. But the risk is this is just one-time money, and we have to be very sure on how we're going to spend it, because you typically don't want to spend one-time money on long-term recurring expenses, because once the money's gone, it's gone. So we would have to talk about some other plans on how we can deal with the budget in the next 5 years.
You talked about wanting to have a conversation here regarding where the board feels would be the safest space to project as far as the percent increase for expenses. Given the examples that you spoke about, utilities, transportation, the contracts, being at anything, being anything less than even the 7% increase seems risky.
Well, all of these are going to be a risk because you'll see all of them have negative numbers. So we're going to have to, if this is truly what our expenses are going to look like, then unless we can foresee some additional revenue, then we're, in this scenario, all of these scenarios are going to have to dip into fund balance in order to balance this budget, if this is the way that we feel comfortable with the expenses. I mean, we can always reduce expenses. We can look at things that we aren't going to do anymore. And the other thing is we just do not know what the legislature is doing there. They have a lot of proposals that either could cost us a lot of money or could get us some additional revenue. So they're, right now, it's just bad timing right now with the legislatures. Every funding year, every 2 years, you're kind of in this limbo where they haven't finished their work yet. Although the governor has said he doesn't anticipate a extension, then hopefully they'll get their work done. If he has to call a special session, it'll extend to, could be into the summer before we know the final numbers.
Thankfully, we have legislators that are aware of the challenge with the calendars not matching up and advocating for that to change. It's an ongoing problem.
Yes, it is. And again, we'll keep you informed as we know what they, if there's any proposals that they actually pass, and then the governor also has to sign them, so. It could be a long process, but we'll keep an eye on it and just make sure that you see any of the changes and how they affect our either expenses or revenues.
Tammy, I have a question. So I appreciate you putting together the kind of the big legislative stuff that we're talking about or we're hearing about that is going to cost us money. But as you hear about other bills being passed with regard to like mandates on curriculum or how do you are you able to quantify that and put that in as an expense?
You can make some assumptions. You can kind of look at past history. You can look at what you're currently doing. I would work with our academic team to see what they're hearing, what they think is needed.
Included.
Yeah, and not to pull from this topic, but in that same line, what you see in our legislative proposal costs are those big ticket items that we know will have significant impact. Many of you and many of us have been at the Capitol advocating, from our platform, but also pushing back on some of the unfunded mandates that nevertheless find themselves, in the omnibus bills, and they do come with tails, and so the smaller ones that Director Atkinson was mentioning, again, there's curricular costs if mandated curriculum comes across, right, that might not exist in our district. If we can't augment what we currently have, then we're going to have to, put an RFP out for getting additional curriculum to meet any standards changes or course changes that come from the legislature. And again, I can't stress enough to the board and to our community, relinquishing local control is probably the most costly thing that could happen. And I'm not saying that you are advocating for that, but I think it's just a good, strong message to our community here tonight and who might be watching this back. Now is the time to make calls to our local representatives to ensure the greatest thing that could happen for us is that we have autonomy with the resources that come through the legislature for us to make decisions as a community. There are just some things that will be really bad for kids if they're legislated. Good intent, and I've said this many a time with our elected officials. I don't question the intent of many of the things, but we have to look at the details of what that actually means once we hit the play button. There's impacts to that, not just dollars.
Tammy, I've got a question. When we start talking about, especially the impact of legislation, but also the increase in costs, we can only really cut variable costs. We can't cut fixed costs. How much of our percentage of our budget are variable costs?
It's very small. I mean, 85% of our budget is salaries and fringe benefits. So if you're going to reduce any significantly, that means looking at programs and some of those things that we just so far have not been having to cut.
So with that, on the cost of programs and stuff, I'm talking fixed costs. We need the lights on here, whether one person's in the room or 100 people are in the room, right? We need internet no matter what. Those are other fixed costs, not just salary and benefits.
We have software renewal fees for all of our software. We lease our computers for the kids. So that's going to be an ongoing cost. There's, utilities is huge. While we have some funding, like the long-term facilities maintenance, that we can cover some of the work at the schools, there are some things that aren't covered in that will come out of the general fund. Some of those maintenance things in buildings, so those are always going to be there.
Have we ever had like a grouping of the true variable costs and to know where, obviously we're lean, but it would be good to just understand that and how little is actually spent in that space, as you're saying, because that's kind of a huge decision point.
Yep, we can break that down for you.
Can you give an example or two of variables? Am I saying that right? The
Variable versus fixed costs.
thank you. Yes.
Some of those variable things we have very little.
Some of it could be supplemental curriculum that we purchase. That's a variable cost. Outside of our core reading curriculum, for example, some of our assessment suites that we run as well could be a variable cost.
Some of the PD that we do, we would be able to do.
Professional development for staff. Those are kind of the soft variable costs that we're not mandated to do necessarily, but to Vice Chair's point, people are programs in education. You know, we don't have a computer that runs a lot of different technologies for us. Like if we want to run an intervention program or an acceleration program for gifted students, there's people power behind that and curriculum behind that, right? That is supplemental. But those are some of the examples of where our costs are so lean. Our margin is very lean in terms of impact to students. So if we have to make reductions based upon some of these scenarios, to Director Bullian's point, they all have a risk. And you've heard from us, we're playing it very conservatively. And I think it's very good to be prudent with some of these unknowns. And so I think, I agree. I think anything less than 7, I think we get very wishful thinking. And I think that's pretty dangerous. So I think that's probably the minimum floor. Not that you're asking, but if you're wondering what's in my head, that would probably be my floor. And we have to be prepared to think about where we've been, let's say, 7, 8 years ago, when maybe it was more like 10 years ago, those of you who've been around, when we had some bigger cuts.
We had some cuts just a couple of years ago.
Okay,
Yeah.
so
2 years ago, we had major cuts.
So we understand that we want to be stewards of the resources that we have, but I'm also looking back at some of the historical budget adjustments that we've made that to date we might be paying for by way of looking at our enrollment. Did we cut in the wrong areas? And people made decisions that they needed to make at that time, so I'm not questioning that in the board and the leadership at that time. But we really need to be thinking, 7, 10 years from now, what does that cut look like when, the decision makers today might be different, 10 years from now in terms of what's happening and what's the return for our kids. And I think there's some correlation, can't say it's causation. When I look back at some of our reductions, there are some key things that we did in our district because of financial reasons, which again, needed to be decided. But there's some correlation between when we started seeing some attendance shifts with some of those cuts too. So deep programmatic changes in some of our campuses or support to students were reduced. That was probably the beginning, give or take a year or so, as I looked at the data, of our quantifiable trend to start losing students. So we have to be careful. It's a double-edged sword, not to use that as a pun of cuts, but we will recommend what we believe is right. And as Tammy said, some of our neighboring districts are in really tough situations. Thankfully, we're not there, and we don't want to get there. So how do we remain competitive, delivering on high-quality instruction, core academic frameworks for our kids, preparing them for their college life and beyond, and be mindful of our dollars?
So basically, if we have to cut, and hopefully we don't, hopefully the legislature doesn't put a whole bunch of wish lists in here that actually take away from any benefit that we do get from the added funding. But then we really should look at and measure the cuts according to the impact to educational outcomes.
Correct.
And long-term educational outcomes.
Correct. So you all have heard me say since the day of my interviewing for this role that I'm very fiscally conservative when it comes to school funding, and legacy programming is something that many districts are guilty of. And I'm not suggesting that exists. I'm sure it doesn't to some extent, but things that we've always done because we've always done it. And we have to ask the tough question, what return does that give to our students? Does that increase their performance? Does that prepare them for college? Does that prepare them for their careers? And there are some things that we might be doing that we should ask ourselves, you know, like I said, we might be choosing between what's good and what's good. And we have to ask ourselves, what's better of the good? So those are tough decisions to make. But we'll do our best to give you as much context around some of these so that we're not short-sighted on perhaps some decisions that we might need to make as a team. But we'll, like I said, we don't want to get there, right? But we have some wild cards that we just can't play, that are out of our control.
Then that last document is some of those legislative proposals that will either cost us money or get us some revenue. So if all of them pass, it really has not much of a net effect. It would actually cost us $224,000 more than what we got if all of these passed. And that's a big if.
I mean, I got a quick question. So one of the things that has been discussed in the governor's plan is to phase in the increases. So that's one thing that I don't think we really considered. If the governor's plan goes in, then we don't get the money right away. They would phase in the increases, and they're supposed to then keep the increases going every year, or do we face another biennium where they can wipe it out and make it down to zero again?
Yes, that is always a risk. That we're in a unique position in this state that we have a Democratic House, Senate, and governor. There will be elections coming up, and it's possible that that dynamic will change, and it is certainly possible that legislation will change. So kind of at the mercy of what's happening over in St. Paul, and all we can do is plan accordingly and have some contingency plans that say we have to have plan A, B, C, and D, probably E and F too.
Yeah, with this case, but what's worse is they could actually give us a 5% for the next 2 years, wipe that out, but these remain evergreen.
Correct.
Absolutely.
Correct.
So it's even worse than this.
It could be. And we're just talking about the current reality that we know is front and center, but we don't know what we don't know and can't control outcomes or votes, elections, I'm sorry. But you're absolutely right, Vice Chair Franz. This is the challenge, that we have essentially a risk of unfunded mandates that will come forward if we have, different folks, representing us in St. Paul that might undo some of these revenue streams, but keep all of these aspects of expenditures. So, yeah, then you look at this bottom line of nearly $5 million in big bill costs. A bulk of that could be coming our way. Absolutely.
What's not on this list that I know is being talked about too in the community too, that I think maybe the minute version or 2-minute version about the universal lunch bill, because we're kind of in a different scenario than most of the other districts in our state, and I think it might behoove us to just kind of give the 20,000-foot view of what that means for us.
I actually, Emily Malone is here somewhere, yes. I've actually asked her to be here tonight to speak about this one, so as she's coming up, again, here's a great example. I'm gonna be careful how I say it, but this is a very emotional bill, right? It's politically hard to say I don't want to put food in the belly of a kid. But there's nuances at the local level, specifically ours, that I think are important for our board and for our community to understand, because several years ago, our students spoke up about what they're looking for, right? And, I'm really proud about our students for having done that. I know we're the only high school at this point, in this space, but they were advocating for what they felt was right for them, and quite frankly, they're right. So this is a great opportunity, if we had a mandated option, what would that do to a local option that we have supported for several years now? So with that, I'll turn it over to Emily.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. So universal meals was written into law on St. Patrick's Day. And a couple things, despite what the Star Tribune published as it's starting the following Monday, it doesn't actually start until next school year. But this is one of the examples of something that went really quickly through the legislature and has some impacts, like Dr. Thomas said. It was written into law on the 17th. It's written so that there is funding for next school year, which is school year 24 and school year 25. And then there isn't a plan after that. This legislature does not have a plan for after that. Some of us may or may not know that compensatory revenue is calculated using free reduced meal applications, which is something that's run through child nutrition programs. Again, it's got a plan through school year 25. So for the next 2 years, there's a no fault. Actually, the school year 24, which is next school year, was already calculated in October of this current school year. And then there's a no fault clause in the universal meals bill that says if in school year 25 you don't have families filling out that free reduced meal app because meals are free and they don't correlate the need or the benefit, don't worry, school year 24 numbers will work for school year 25. But again, then there's no plan after that. So that could have a pretty big impact on school meal programs for sure. What is unique about our district is that Prior Lake High School is off of the National School Lunch Program. What that means is we don't receive federal or state dollars to run our program at all. We still feed free and reduced priced children or families that qualify for free reduced meals still get fed for free, just like they do everywhere else in the state, but we just don't take funding from the state's city of Minnesota or the feds to fund that. We absorb that cost on our own with our high school budget. So if we adopted the universal meals legislature at the Prior Lake High School, then many things would change as far as the program goes. The reason why students wanted to come off of it, they were very savvy students in school year 2014-15. They came to us with a petition that was signed by a couple thousand students, and they said, you know what? We don't want to be on the National School Lunch Program or to adopt the Smart Snacks program, which is what Michelle Obama's Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act was all about. Because we want to see bigger portions. I think they had very good data and research, and they said 75% of our student body is active before and after school, and the amount of calories that we're allowed to have at lunch is not enough for us, and we want to be able to choose our own portions, and we want better choice, and we're also noticing that we have to throw away a lot of food, and that is part of the National School Lunch Program. You do have to have a certain number of components on your tray, and so if a student, doesn't want something, you can't actually let them go through the entire lunch line without choosing the certain components that they're supposed to. So oftentimes you have to send them back and say, hey, grab an apple, or hey, grab a milk, and then we're allowed to let them go through. At the high school, we don't have to do that because we're not on the National School Lunch Program, and students can choose the portion size and the items that they want to. That's the gist of it.
Yeah, to your other point, and just around food waste and free and reduced lunch, if I can just speak to that a little bit. So again, students will be forced to take things that they don't want to have, and it's painful to watch a kid grab a milk, open it, dump it out, take whatever immediately into the trash, and they go sit down. So food waste is high on those types of programs. The other concern, again, when we talk about the tails that will come back wagging after the next biennium, we're good through 25. So after 25, there's no guarantee kind of rollover for free and reduced lunch status. Many grants that we receive, whether it's federal grants, private philanthropic grants, are premised on free and reduced lunch counts. Millions of dollars come into our district around free and reduced lunch counts, right? And we, again, we have families who have those needs, and we're going to support those families. But again, when we go to the market for competitive, supplemental grants, if we're not guaranteed that status without having to have families fill out these forms, we will not be able to demonstrate need to compete for significant grants. So these unanswered pieces are some of the risks that Director Bullion was asking about, like, they're baked in here, but that's the story that's not being printed in the Star Tribune. So it's very important that this board and our community understands, again, the intent of this bill. I fully understand that. And having worked in high poverty school systems, I can also tell you that we have had partnerships with philanthropy that provide angel funds. There's never been a kid that goes unfed in any district that I've been in. High urban poverty district, big, large suburban districts that I've been in, there's not a kid that goes unfed. So I just need you all to know that. I'll stop there. So turn it back to you, Vice Chair Frank.
So first of all, does anybody have any questions?
Probably just more a comment. Yeah, I appreciate you coming in and staying to provide that context. If we don't have to look very far to see the effects of this kind of work. Looking at the course of the pandemic, where we had funding available and provided meals to every student. We didn't see a lot of individuals applying for free and reduced lunch. And then when it came time for additional COVID funding, we were left without that data to support or justify why we needed that level of funding, especially in relation to other districts of comparable size or comparable areas of need, because people weren't necessarily applying. That left quite a substantial deficit that we had to make up for.
I have a question. I'm more concerned about, so we get a flat rate, and I've got several questions with this that have not been answered also by the legislators. So they pay for the lunches. What are the guidelines for what is served then? What are the guidelines for the bidding process for our dairy, for our bread, et cetera, that we usually go through? Has any of that been worked out?
None of that has changed or been worked out that I know of. And I will also say that, so there's guidelines for the meal components. We follow those guidelines throughout K-12. We offer the same things at the high school that we offer, the same number, or the same types of components, I should say, and those are legumes and red and green and vegetables and all of that. So we offer all of that K-12. It's just that our portion sizes at K-12 give students more choice to choose how much or how little they want, and the K-8 have to take the 3/4 a cup of, a leafy vegetable or so on. So, but no, they haven't said what the reimbursement would be. MDE hasn't put out anything yet about how universal meals will work or be funded, or not be funded, but be, what rate it will be reimbursed at, so.
So I'm kind of looking at this like, prices go up, and we have been experiencing that. They have to fund it once a year or something, and there's when I read the bill, there was nothing that says that every year we're going to have an inflationary factor or anything like that. So the first question I have is, do we eat the cost difference in order to actually continue with the same food choices and options we have at all levels? And then the second question I have is, what about a la carte? Do we still do that, and how are we going to do that?
Are we talking about K-8? Or
Well,
were you saying in the future?
well, like with the seconds and or get doubles as I
Yeah.
learned as
That's
being on the
that's what they
food
call it.
line,
Yeah.
and then the students that come back with the a la carte and just come back and grab off of certain areas and then
Yeah.
pay for it out of their lunch budget.
Yeah.
How is all that going to get rectified?
Well, we would still offer the a la carte options and seconds, and students would just need to have money in their lunch accounts. But you did, point something out that if the cost of beef goes up one year, because the cost of they calculate commodities at different times than we do business. So we do our milk bid, almost a year ahead of time and so on. So whatever that price of dairy is, if in that school year, something happens, which we've seen several times in the last decade, and that price of milk goes up, they haven't said whether or not the reimbursement would also go up to match it. That's definitely something that hasn't been.
Mm.
Somebody else have got another question, but I don't want to hog it. So my other question is going on to what Dr. Thomas was saying about the grants and all that, that's actually tied to the individuals who qualify for free and reduced lunch. And I've said this before, not everyone applies for free and reduced lunch. The forms are not easy to fill out. Our poverty level is fairly low anyways, the percentage. And so, I mean, you know, a lot of people don't bother, or they just, you know, go around it, or they, you know, all that. So but that was the only way that the district really had of knowing the economic situations of some of the kids. And we don't have any visibility into, you know, what their tax claims are or their income claims are to the state. So in general, how do we understand the economic diversity of our school district without the free and reduced lunch program?
That's an unknown, Vice Chair France. I mean, that's a variable that's just unknown at this time. And so to know the economic viability of those that we serve in our district, similar to what Director Velasquez was saying, we got grandfathered because of COVID for that 1 year's time. That carried forward. We didn't have to have families fill out, and part of that, you know, so reimbursable and all that. But without that, it's a proxy for so many things. And yes, generally speaking, a community like ours is different than like a community like Minneapolis, where you have higher concentrations of need, but nonetheless, the needs are here too. And so we wouldn't be able to articulate that if there's no requirement. So that's an unintended consequence. And what I keep referring to informally as the tail coming back wagon, that, yeah, we may be on the hook for some things that, for a good intention bill, but it definitely comes with some unknowns.
Are there any ideas that we could promote to legislature to kind of soften the blow of this? Other than, you know, I think it's true that it's a sensitive topic because there's a huge amount of need, and we do want to make sure that all kids are fed. Not all districts are the same, but is there any other thing that you guys would suggest that we actually phrase to our legislators to help them understand the impact of this and how to soften that impact so that we can we don't have to actually, you know, run into some of the situations with the compensatory funding, and also the, you know, the sometimes volatile changes in prices that can occur.
$1 million question, I think, but I do know that other states calculate that. I don't even know if it's called compensatory revenue in other states, but I do know that there are other ways to calculate that. But I watched it very closely as it went through legislature this year, and it was asked many different times in many different ways, and there were suggestions given by different senators, and nothing ever took hold. So.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you.
I guess it's just amazing to me that these questions are brought up here, and we'll sign a bill into law. And so many of these questions are made.
I would agree, but I do think that part of it is because they wanted to do something. This is a quick, everyone understands free and reduced lunch.
100%, yeah.
But I don't think everyone understands how much stuff is tied into that. And it's a very difficult topic. I didn't realize it was that difficult until it all came up and I realized just how much was actually tied into it.
Just a comment based on kind of the overview of what we've been talking about, from enrollment to, you know, the food to everything that we've just brought up. There's so many things that we don't have control over that we're waiting for, but there are things that we have control over, such as what all of our presenters talked about today. And I think those kind of things are really important for us as a board to listen to and to make those kinds of changes in our district that will give families a sense of security enrolling here and being and staying here. So I just wanted to add that comment.
Do we have anything else that we want to talk about with the legislative impact at all? Okay. Staffing update.
So given all of the things that we talked about, kind of see the different scenarios and moving forward, there were some very obvious academic needs that we saw right now. So we feel like we need to move forward with those, and I think Emily has some of those details that we can talk about.
So, thank you, members of the board, Dr. Thomas. One of the things that we tried really hard this year with our school administration, district administration, was to move up our staffing timeline. Historically, we have done the first step of that at the April board meeting. We moved it up to the meeting after the work session today, so that we can be more competitive with other school districts. A lot of other school districts are actually doing their recruiting and hiring in February and March. So we're already behind on that, but we worked really hard to move it up even this year, so that we can get our postings out before the big Minnesota Education Job Fair on Thursday that we'll be attending to help recruit for these vital positions. And that's why you'll see some things coming forward tonight at the board meeting that used to historically come in April or May. So with that, we are looking to get all the positions out for our certified staffing for next year, so we can, that we know of, so that we can start recruiting and start getting those candidates, because we know that it's an extremely competitive pool right now for all positions. And especially our certified positions that are so vital to our school district. So looking at moving forward with that and getting those postings out there, knowing that we don't know the finals on the budget parameters, but getting those postings that we know are out there open, so we can start recruiting and not lose out on those valuable candidates. Does anyone have any questions for me on the staffing timeline, the staffing for next school year?
We are going to take this to the board to vote on that particular topic tonight. So just for the reason that you just stated, that we want to get a heads up on being able to hire and get our staffing organized. So all that information is in the board packet. Does anybody have any questions about what we're going to vote on to discuss now, or?
And Director Franz, I've been failed to remiss too. The other reason to move it up as well is we want all of our staff to have that ability to make those decisions during this time as well. So if we do have any staff that we don't have an opening for next year, we wanted to move that communication up so they get that in a more timely manner as well, and they're not waiting to hear that message till April or May, and a lot of districts have already made their choices. So it's not just for us to be able to recruit and hire for the openings we have, but also for our staff that don't have an opening next year, to be able to get out to those districts that are currently posting. So just wanted to add that piece as well.
Anybody have any questions on what's going to happen with this staffing, the reasons why? And I have one really quick question, since everyone's looking at me like, okay, no questions. So we're actually doing this later than our surrounding districts right now. Still, are we going to make a plan for next year to move this up even earlier?
Correct. So, great question. We moved it up as early as we could this year, but I always consider the staffing process like the very last train on the track. We have course proposals that come in the fall that then go through that whole process for renewal. Then we have registrations and we have enrollment, and all those pieces have to come together for us to know what are our staffing needs and what adjustments do we need to make accordingly. So we couldn't move it up any further this year because those other pieces were already scheduled, it was already in motion. But we are looking at how can we move it up further next year, but still allow the needed time for those other pieces to occur. So we are looking with the school administration and district administration to look at how we can move that staffing timeline up even further.
Our ideal state would be about mid-February.
Okay.
So
So if that's mid-February, then we want to start discussing it in the study session in January.
it does. We got, as Emily said, that train left the station, and so when I realized what our timeline was around the staffing, this was as much as we could do with those other pieces in play. So everything will be moved up essentially about a month in advance compared to where we were this year. So all of the preliminary staffing projections, position description, or course descriptions, et cetera, all of that will be advanced up into our schedule about a month. So everything will leave earlier next year. And so we'll be, again, our ideal is by mid-February, we are dropping opening positions.
Okay.
We are wanting to compete for the A-list players. And, right now, we know that districts are getting very creative. We have neighboring districts who are offering some significant incentive programs, grow your own programs, et cetera. These are the types of investments that I think we as a board, as a community, need to have discussions about because we're all vying for very few top-notch staff out there. So the more creative we can be and the more timely we can be, the more advantageous of getting high-quality staff in our schools will be.
So Emily, I just have a question. So the positions that were listed in our board packet, those are all one-year positions, and so like legally they have to reapply, correct? Or how does, I want to make sure I understood
Not all
you
of
correctly.
them. So there are multiple different reasons for a probationary certified contract to be non-renewed. One is licensure, so any tier 1 licensure by statute needs to be non-renewed. There's the one-year position, so anyone who's filling a long-term substitute position. There's a lack of enrollment or registration, so if there's not enough registration in a certain licensure area, then there's a non-renew for that reason. And then there's also a performance non-renew reason. So there's multiple that play into that overall list.
Okay.
And Emily, correct me if I'm wrong too, just like the tier 1 piece that you gave an example of, by statute we have to release. But if that position doesn't fill, that doesn't mean that we couldn't hire that person back because by statute we had to
Right.
make that. But if it's still vacant and they're still available, we'll clearly take them back.
Okay.
So how many positions, Emily, are you going to this job fair on Thursday looking to fill? That's part one. And then B, what can we do, we meaning our community, do to maybe help you, maybe get the word, other than, the basic stuff, social media, tell your friends, all of that. Is there anything else that maybe we can't think of that would help you and your team and our district to get the word out?
I'm a broken record on this, so I apologize, but in all sincerity, what data will show you the best way is word of mouth from somebody that somebody trusts and knows. So any recruiting to your network, sharing out our social media posts, sharing our links, just talking about the district and working for the district is the best recruitment tool we have. We will continue to do every other recruiting possibility within our means. But that's statistically is the best way to recruit, is for somebody to hear it from a trusted individual. I don't have the exact number off the top of my head of the FTE we're going to the education fair with, but we do have different world languages with German, French, we have elementary openings, we have math opening at the high school. So a lot of different special education openings for certified staff as well. So there's a long list, and I can definitely get you those numbers.
I just want to say that I know that since my time here on the board, the first couple of times I saw that large non-renew list, like, oh my gosh, getting rid of all these people. But then every year, the percentage of first year that have to be renewed contractually, that have to be renewed because of licensure, this happens every single year. And it is a little shocking the first time, but it's also out there, which I do appreciate. Instead of telling people, particularly ones that are long-term substitutes and stuff like that, which they kind of know anyways. I mean, it's not like we're, but we do want them to apply. And until we go through this process, they can't apply because we haven't gone, as the board, gone through this. So to refill those positions, we want to get them the news as soon as possible so we can reapply and really know what our gaps are, which is really confusing to somebody who is brand new to this.
Yeah, I'm confused.
Yeah.
I had made a note on our packet. I wrote, this is a long list, and given the fact that we have teaching positions that we haven't been able to fill, I asked, how do these non-renewals affect our students, our schools, and our class sizes? Because it is like, oh my goodness, right?
Yeah.
But this is just a process that we have to go through, given they're a first-year teacher. Is that what I'm hearing?
Not necessarily. So if they're a first-year teacher, but they're on a tier 2, 3, or 4 licensure, we do not have to do that. If they're on a tier 1 licensure, we do. If they're filling a long-term substitute position because they're filling for a leave of absence, for example, we do have to non-renew those. So those are all, and then if there's a reduction in a course, for example, there's not enough registration in a course, and we have to non-renew a probationary staff member because of lack of registration. All of those, when their administrator had the conversation with them that they're going forward to the board as a non-renewal, the major talking point is please reapply. We highly value you, you're doing very well, we really enjoy your, we really want you to come back. And so you'll also see some of the names on the non-renew are also on the recommendation for hire. So you'll see a lot of those names twice because it's just a process that we have to follow because of how the system, the wagging tail, the system, yeah, the system that we have to just operate with under.
Yeah.
So we try our best to communicate that to them and to piggyback after Director France's comment. It's an uncomfortable position to not know. And so if we're moving this up further, we can help answer those questions and help bring them security that there is a position and we can rehire them right away and get that process going. So they're not waiting until the end of April or the end of May to know, do I still have a position with the district or do I need to look elsewhere because I don't know what my status will be. So we're hopeful that that's also going to help speed up that process a little bit for them as well.
A few years ago, I think we did this in May, which was really beautiful. I do have a question though, and this is on topic, but something that just dawned on me. The legislature is changing or attempting to change through statute all these tiers and licensure requirements and certification requirements. If what's on the plate right now, which I personally do not understand all the different levels and tiers and stuff like that, if that passed, would that affect this process that we're going through?
I don't believe so. The only ones that I'm aware of is there's a difference between the Senate and the House currently. And the only ones I'm aware of at the House is it's not to change, that there'll still be the 4 tiers, but it's going to change the different opportunities from getting from tier 2 to tier 3. And the Senate appears to be expanding that opportunity, where the House bill appears to be limiting that opportunity, which we, the organization I'm a part of has raised our concerns around because we want We want the ability for more of our certified staff to be able to move through the tier system and not have to remain a tier 1 or a tier 2. So it's very hard to dig through all the details because it's changing constantly, but my understanding is there's a difference between the two, and one is limiting the tier 1 to the tier 2 to tier 3, and the other one is expanding that opportunity. But they still have the tiers. But we are monitoring closely and trying to keep up.
Are there any other questions?
I think one thing that Dr. Thomas, correct me if I'm wrong, that we're hoping for is just agreement that we can continue to move forward with our hiring process to help get these candidates and help recruit at the job fair with these postings. So if there's any concerns or if we can move forward with that.
You know, the list that you gave us, those will be all the postings, is that correct, or am I?
There'll be more postings than just that because there are other openings from resignations, retirements, leaves that are not currently filled by a staff member that's on the non-renew list. So there are others as well.
Okay.
But generally, this is the direction, and so, you know, I guess my request to the board is there anyone not okay with us moving in this direction so that we can be competitive in a very lean industry?
No issues.
Okay, so we'll go forward with this direction, and
We'll be voting on the list.
yeah, later on this evening.
Yeah, later on this evening.
Thank you.
Okay. So before we vote again, just last call, does anybody have any more questions, concerns, comments?
I'll just have a clarifying statement that direction that you're asking for is that we move up this process. That's what you were asking.
Actually, more specifically, it would be the ability for us to take these positions that we have shared with you to the hiring fair beginning this Thursday. That's the direction. The other stuff is more internal management, which we are going to continue to move up because we need to be more competitive and get out there earlier than we are now.
Okay, with that, let's move on. We have 3 proclamations to read, and I'm going to split up the reading of the proclamations in order. So the first one, Amy Bullion, if you could read that, and then the second one, Director Velasquez, Enrique, and then the third one, if Lisa, if you could read that, and then we'll just start with the first proclamation. And then I believe that we will have somebody from the administration come up and also address it. So Amy, go ahead with Equity Services Proclamation.
Equity Services Staff Appreciation Week, April 10th through 14th. Prior Lake Savage Area Schools recognizes April 10th through 14th, 2023 as Equity Services Staff Appreciation Week. Our Equity Services staff support the development of learning environments to ensure high achievement for each and every student. This week, we celebrate our thanks and gratitude for these essential staff. Whereas the month of April is Celebrate Diversity Month, a time to recognize, honor, and celebrate the diversity surrounding us. Whereas the Equity and Inclusion Department staff consists of a Director of Equity and Inclusion, Administrative Assistant, American Indian Ed Coordinator, Spanish speaking and East African liaisons, and teachers in the English Learner Department. Whereas members of the Equity Services staff have developed an achievement and an integration plan to address the achievement gap by developing cultural awareness in our staff and students, providing equitable academic opportunities and support, and increasing student and family engagement. Whereas members of the Equity Services staff supports staff and students to overcome barriers to closing the achievement and opportunity gaps that many students face through providing professional development and connecting to community resources. Whereas the Equity and Inclusion Department provides resources to staff close the language barrier and increase the understanding of the refugee and immigrant experiences through collaboration with various refugee resettlement agencies and providing interpreting support. Whereas members of the Equity Services staff work collaboratively with teachers and principals to support for marginalized students, focused on building inclusive and safe classrooms where every student feels a sense of belonging, seen, safe, and secure, allowing them to reach their fullest potential. Therefore, let it be resolved, the Board of Education hereby extends its appreciation to all Prior Lake Savage Area Schools Equity Services staff for supporting the equitable education of our students and declares April 10th through 14th, 2023 to be Equity Services Staff Appreciation Week in Prior Lake Savage Area Schools. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Director Bullion, for reading that. Members of the board, Dr. Thomas. The proclamation talks a lot about members in the equity department, but I think the gratitude definitely goes beyond that as well to all the teachers who provide differentiated instructions in the classroom, people in the community who has come alongside this work as well. I always say equity work is work we do together. The Equity Advisory Committee that we have here in our district, the APAC Parent Committee that we have also. So definitely thank you, and all thanks go to them as well.
Thank you, Sam. Dr. Thomas, did you want to add anything?
No.
Okay. So Enrique, if you would read the proclamation from the National Occupational Therapist Month.
Certainly. Proclamation, National Occupational Therapist Month, April 2023. Prior Lake Savage Area Schools recognizes April 2023 as National Occupational Therapist Month. This month we celebrate the occupational therapy profession and the contributions occupational therapists make in the school setting. Occupational therapists are key members of a school team. They contribute towards students' overall ability to participate in daily school activities. Occupational therapists support students to reach both academic and non-academic achievements by addressing the physical, cognitive, psychosocial, and sensory components of performance. Occupational therapists bring a unique skill set to assist teams with screenings, provide teacher training and consultation, model activities to whole classrooms or small groups, and assist with team problem solving. Occupational therapists at PLSAS also provide direct services as outlined in students' individualized education plans, IEPs. This may include adapting the environment, modifying curriculum, supporting accommodations, and ensuring access and participation in school activities. Services are designed to support progress on a student's IEP goals and objectives. Therefore, let it be resolved, the Board of Education hereby extends its appreciation to all Prior Lake Savage Area Schools occupational therapists for their work supporting students and proclaims April 2023 to be National Occupational Therapist Month in Prior Lake Savage Area Schools.
Thank you for that. I just want to give a little shout out. Occupational therapists are kind of like little unsung heroes in the district. We have 5, and there isn't an area of a student's kind of academic and educational day that they don't touch if students demonstrate the need for their support. So it's, whether it's academic support, social support, sensory support, activities of daily living, they really touch it all. And so just a little shout out of appreciation for the 5 that we have here at Prior Lake Savage Area Schools.
Thank you. And Lisa, would you read the proclamation on Media Specialist Appreciation Week?
Yes. Prior Lake Savage Area Schools recognizes April 3rd through the 7th, 2023 as Media Specialist Appreciation Week. Our media specialists provide media support and guidance for our more than 8,600 students, preparing them for success in a globally competitive world. This week, we celebrate our thanks and gratitude for these essential staff. Whereas April 4th is celebrated annually as National School Librarian Day. Whereas media specialists provide guidance to students through print media, literature, digital resources, and technology. Whereas media specialists provide professional development and support to teachers and other school district staff. Whereas media specialists set students up for success in their future education and careers by teaching them how to search for and research information. Whereas media specialists support students in their use of technology to help create equitable access for all students and to empower and enhance the teaching and learning experience. Whereas media specialists are a wealth of knowledge and information who come up with creative ways to teach and connect with students. Therefore, let it be resolved, the Board of Education hereby extends its appreciation to all Prior Lake Savage Area Schools media specialists for supporting the education of our students and staff, and declares April 3rd through the 7th, 2023 to be Media Specialist Appreciation Week in Prior Lake Savage Area Schools.
Thank you, Director Atkinson, members of the board. Certainly, as is the case with many of our employee groups, this is a very lean group of employees here in Prior Lake Savage Area Schools that serve a number of students, our 8,600 students. And the job of this person, these individuals, is a constantly changing role. And we appreciate the work that they all do to support our students in this area, and appreciate the shout out and recognition.
Okay, so next on the agenda is board policy review. We have for the very first time that we're going to be discussing these are the 606, selection and review of learning resources, and after that, policy 806, crisis management.
Thank you, Vice Chair France. This evening, we're going to be talking about some of the proposed changes to policy 606. And this is our introduction of this policy to you all. Last fall, we assembled a team of staff to begin a committee of looking at policy 606. Given some of the public comment that we heard this evening, as well as what we are mindful of around the country, this is a very important issue in many communities. And I want to be the first to say that we need to ensure that we are bringing strong, enriching literature materials to our kids and having access to a variety of materials that they will be engaged with. We also have to balance that with our responsibility to ensuring that the materials that we are providing to our kids are developmentally, socially, et cetera, appropriate, for our students. And I have to say that this conversation, what we heard this evening, I think are some very glaring examples of context that, prompts these types of discussions. We also know that there are some gray areas where there are going to be, what's acceptable to one family, even though it's rated for X, age level, might not be accepted for another family. And so we're taking a lot of that into consideration as we build out this policy. I want to thank Dr. Edwards and the team who have been working, with this process. We've engaged many of our library media specialists that we've just proclaimed this evening as well for their expertise and insights on this as well. And also hearing from some of our community, and both in support of some significant changes to be made, as well as, I'll just be very transparent, some concerns that we would be restricting, materials. But again, I think it's our ethical obligation to ensure that what we provide is relevant and rigorous and, academic in nature that will help our students learn. And also be of content that will engage them as readers, and be mindful that the content is appropriate, for our K-12 educational setting. So we want to acknowledge that, and that we are listening to our community and we hear you, as well as our staff. So with that, I'll have Dr. Edwards talk about some of the initial components of the policy. And just for those of you newer to the board, again, this is where we introduce policy. This is our opportunity to roll up our sleeves, get feedback and perspectives from you all. We take that feedback, go back and revise the language in various policies, and then we'll be presenting it back to you in our sequence currently of our first, second, and third readings, et cetera, for our ultimate approval. So tonight is kind of the raw, uncut version for you all to kind of really engage around and then provide some input for our team. So with that, I'll turn it to Dr. Edwards.
All right, thank you, Dr. Thomas. As Dr. Thomas alluded to, we did pull a group of folks together beginning in, I think it was late November, if I remember correctly. Had a number of meetings and conversations, reviewed policies out there, both the MSBA model policy, our existing policy, and other neighboring district policies. And what is put before you tonight, you'll see our former policy with strike-throughs, essentially of the entire policy, with a revised version that we took from the best of other policies that we were looking at in this study. And there were a few key components that are outlined and highlighted or underlined that I want to call your attention to, specifically in the revision policy version that I think begin to address some of the concerns. And to Dr. Thomas's point, there is definitely room for additional review and processes to make sure that we are meeting the spirit of what Policy 606 is intended to do. So I wanted to, I know you all had a chance to review both the policy as well as the resource consideration forms and the guidelines around that form. Should there be a desire for significant reconsideration to be undergone by our teams that are identified in the policy. And what we found in looking at our former policy and comparing it to this existing version, that we felt it flowed much better and more cleanly, kind of laying out the steps. Just a couple of highlights that I wanted to call your particular attention to. At the bottom of page 2 of the policy, for example, when there is a request for reconsideration, the steps taken there are laid out, hopefully very clearly and frankly align with the steps that we've been taking, even though our current policy didn't call for those steps to be taken, specifically meeting with building administration and teacher and or media specialists where there's additional context for a particular resource of concern, working to identify some reasonable alternative titles that might fit, for example, if it's in the case of the classroom situation, might fit the spirit of what that was intended for. And then finally, an opportunity for individual student library records. This is something at the bottom of page 2 that we have not previously had in policy. Should there be a resource that parents or guardians do not want available to their child, making note of that subject title in our library records, either specifically title or general subject area of concern. Also on another highlight that I'd like to call your attention to, it is underlined here on page 3 of the policy, specifically related to the use of challenged resources shall not be restricted. Our former policy said it should not be restricted at all. We have had occasion and would want to provide the opportunity for occasion should something come to our attention that we would deem should not be available and should be restricted, that our policy gives us that administrative authority in policy. So as you noted on page 3 there, number 6, it says unless deemed otherwise by building administration / district administration. So we would allow the opportunity for us to remove something should that be appropriate, and before embarking on the establishment of a committee to reevaluate resources. So those are a couple of highlights I wanted to call out. And then you have, again, before you the guidelines for the reconsideration form that, once again, much more prescriptive and descriptive than our current policy. Current policy 606 does have, if there's a request for reconsideration, there's a one-page form for folks to fill out. This particular policy version that we have before you has guidelines for that form that are very detailed in nature, and then a two-page follow-up form to get more information that would then launch a reconsideration committee to be formed. Additionally, then, we would have procedures that we administratively would follow, laying out the process that, again, aligns with the policy that you see before you.
Okay, with that, open it up to questions. Comments, anything?
I have a lot of questions and comments, but as a new board director, I also want to kind of know how, like if I should just go line by line, how would you like me to, just let it go?
Just
Okay.
let it go.
Gonna let it go. All right, so my first question was, as started from the policy title and how we changed it from, it used to be selection and review of learning resources to selection of library and media materials policy. I'm just gonna read the notes from when I was, going through my packet. I just asked, why the name change? And I think the reason why I'm asking why the name change is because I feel like the labeling it library and media materials policy from selection and review of learning resources. To me, learning resources kind of blankets curriculum and all of the things. Sure. And so I felt like that was a more inclusive, it kind of included everything. So if somebody had an issue with curriculum or something that was brought home or whatever. And to me, this policy is just more specific to library materials, library and media. So if you could share that.
I would certainly, that feedback is helpful to this, as Dr. Thomas, we certainly could make adjustments there with regard to that, be more inclusive. The current concerns have been more specific to library and media, so I think that the point of emphasis maybe was the thought process behind that, but we certainly could open that up to be more inclusive.
Well, I just know as a parent, of the district, way prior to me, board director, obviously, since I've only been here a couple months, the challenges that I've had with any curriculum I've brought to the teacher, and then if needed be, that would go farther, and then there's always been accommodations being made. I actually never, as a parent, looked to go this far, but as a board director, I would be in favor of having a more, this seems like it's excluding curriculum to me, in my viewpoint when I, that title.
Well, and I had the same question, and my question was, does this include the books in the classroom? Because when it says specifically here, library and media materials, but what about, like I questioned the same thing, how it said learning resources, because when you think about learning resources, every teacher has a library in their classroom that they supplement either for the kids to be able to check out or they can supplement their curriculum with. So that's where I was wondering the same thing.
And I think B on page 1 is intended to address that. However, if we need to strengthen that, to do so, page 1 and continuing on to page 2.
I wondered too, the very first sentence, we provide a wide range of instructional materials. Would it be good to define what instructional materials entail, like under the definitions?
The definitions is blank. They should
Yeah,
say the
we have
point.
some definitions.
I wondered if that was something that we
Yep.
needed to define for the
Yep.
policy. Would that cover?
Yeah, good point.
Okay, so if we're ready for me to go down my list, okay. Under purpose, I just written a comment that, you know, the purpose stated in this policy compared to the original is very different. It's worded very different. Board of Education isn't even mentioned in the original purpose language. And personally, when I read the original policy language to the second policy language, to the revised, I'm just in favor of the original language. I feel like it just is much more descriptive. One of the things that I highlighted, and I didn't actually, I highlighted the last sentence, the board allows the review of allegedly inappropriate instructional materials through established procedures. And then my note was, as a parent, this language feels vague, and it doesn't give, and again, speaking as a parent, it doesn't give me a sense of security knowing that, you know, every family, every household is gonna have, like Dr. Thomas, like you mentioned, a different definition of what's appropriate and inappropriate. The original language of the purpose talks about, you know, First Amendment rights and, you know, so on and so forth. And so I'm just, maybe you can share a little bit more on, I mean, because we really did change it completely.
Well, and actually, one of the iterations of the review that I referenced earlier, we actually looked at the MSBA policy
Sure.
at one point, and that was only 2 pages in length.
Okay.
And much more refined, I don't know if refined would be the right word.
Succinct.
Succinct would be the better word.
Sure.
And we didn't feel, we initially were going down a path of taking that policy on, but as we looked more broadly and looked for additional policies out there to consider. So I think your point is well taken, particularly with the opening paragraph and purpose, returning that in, being more comprehensive, more inclusive. Certainly, I hear that feedback.
Before we go on, does anybody else have any questions on just this section so far? Because otherwise, Amy's just going to take the floor, which I'm fine with. But I just want to make sure that we're not going to go all the way backwards and forwards and then get kind of a,
Yeah.
Sure.
yeah.
I'm good there, because I would agree, yeah, and sometimes I feel like with these policies, more words are more confusing, so I think if we can simplify it.
So that's actually that's part of why you see a truncated purpose.
Yeah.
That has been the spirit of many of our policy revisions, is to clean up language, keep it succinct, get to the point without being so verbose, because folks aren't gonna read it or they're gonna get lost in it. So hear your feedback on the purpose though, from the original policy to the new policy, and so that is noted.
Yeah, I do have a question. I kind of agree with the more verbose section of the purpose, but I am kind of curious before we move on with that. When we start mentioning U.S. Constitution and First Amendment, are we kind of straying into legal waters that is a little bit more or overly comprehensive than what we're, I mean, I don't know. That's why I'm asking the question. I wasn't sure if that came into play.
It didn't, but I wonder if it could or should, if we should consult, because we have in the past consulted with legal on our certain policies, looking for their review. Maybe that's a necessary step specific to that.
I just wasn't sure, because the first one is, the purpose is much more understandable, but it does bring in concepts that are even broader.
Yep.
And I don't know if that's treading into an area that we don't want
Might
to
be
go
worth
into.
consultation with legal.
Yeah.
When I'm absolutely for the you know, our constitutional rights, I think that, you know, as a people, we know less and less about, I just feel like the constitutional rights are good things to know, but I wouldn't disagree that if it's something that legal should be, you know, consulted.
Yeah, again,
Yeah.
we've done that with other policies. We didn't with this particular one, but we certainly could.
Should I keep going?
You can, yeah.
Please,
You're kind of going through it step by step, so you're kind of helping us all, by the way, so
Yeah.
I'm just
Agreed.
gonna let you take it.
So please, if anyone has anything else to add or, so I'm gonna go down to D, under objections of selection. Providing materials on multiple views of issues that may be controversial, and that's underlined. Again, using that language may be controversial. It is a very gray statement because of everyone has different opinions or ideas of what is controversial and what is not. There's some families that may feel something is very controversial, and some other family may say, I want my child to know this or understand this. So, and I understand that we can't maybe prescribe every detail. It goes on to say, so that users may develop under guidance the practice of critical analysis. And when we're talking about library books in particular, anything that a student can check out, there really is no guidance. So I had just put a note like what guidance, because when a student checks something out, I mean, it's kind of the end of the unless they bring it to a teacher or a media specialist to ask questions.
I have a comment on that, if I may, and a question too. And like everyone here has had, you know, circumstances and their own, you know, families and opinions and things like that. I remember when eons ago, when a high school next to mine outside of Chicago banned The Grapes of Wrath because it talked about poverty, because it had explicit scenes in there and stuff like that. The conversation that ensued from that was also, you know, when we talk about our mission of preparing students for the world and exposing them to not only historical literature, but also, you know, all of that. The concept of that real life exposure doesn't really come through with some of these objectives. And and I'm not sure if it was supposed to. I don't know if it's embedded in here and I'm just reading it through a different lens.
I'm maybe not be tracking you, Director Fran. So you're saying that you're not hearing or seeing in the objectives or maybe in general our mission, that there's not coherence to our current mission?
Well, it's just, you know, we talk about we're preparing kids or students and anyone who goes through our school district, basically, to be productive members of
Citizens
whatever.
of the world, yeah.
So when I look at D and I see the last part of that sentence, the practice of critical analysis and application of real world concepts and lived experiences, I get.
Yeah.
But also with the multiple views, we're actually enabling critical thinking, you know, that sort of thing. And to me, it just didn't come across that way. And I just remember, and you know, that personal experience. And it was parents coming up saying, I don't want my students, and this was a true story, you can read it in the Chicago Tribune, they didn't want their students exposed to poverty because it was disturbing to them.
At that time, in that context. Yeah.
Right. And of course, DuPage County was the highest per capita, you know, income in probably the United States at one time outside of Hollywood and stuff. But and that's kind of the thing that we don't want to enable here. And I'm not sure if that to me, it didn't come across as strong, but it is in here. I just, and, you know, and again, it's
Sure.
my
Yeah,
personal experience, but-
I thank you for clarifying. I'm following what you're saying. I feel like it's expressed in D. From my vantage point as I read it, and I know I'm a little closer and having been reviewing this. But I think the explicit call out of acknowledging there's multiple views on a variety of issues, acknowledgement that issues or content, material may be controversial. Because I think our last one said are controversial. Like we don't want to presuppose what is and what isn't. We're just putting maybe because that is to the individual reader or family, etc. And then I think the feedback about under guidance, I hear your point, Director Bullion, and I think that in that literal sense, I understand what you're saying, and that might send a mixed message in this statement. Because you're right, once I get a book, I may or may not be reading it in class. I might be reading it on the bus or in my privacy of my home or whatever. We went with the assumption that, reading here, reading at home, there's parents, there's teachers, there's staff. That was the understanding, but I could see how you could reinterpret that differently. So I think I'm open to striking that. But the practice of critical analysis, again, within context and within appropriateness, we want our kids to critically analyze. I mean, that's a skill set that we want them to be able to pick apart a text, apply their views, their family values, their learned values, etc. We want them to be able to exercise that. And I think that speaks to your point about the example that you gave, from Chicago, that there are going to be conversations that will ensue. We believe that students can demonstrate that ability, which is actually a different topic to come for us as we talk about what are the attributes of a PLSA graduate that we want to see. So I'll park that for now, but I think that's a different, we can pick it up elsewhere too.
So if I could go back to point 1 and point A, they're similar in statement, but I'm still under general statement of policy.
Okay.
So there's a 1 and
Gotcha.
an A, so we changed the 1 to A. So in 1, in the original policy, we talk about to provide resources that will enrich and support the curriculum, taking into consideration the varied interests, abilities, learning styles, and maturity levels of the students served. And in the new policy, we don't include the word maturity level or age appropriateness. And so I feel like when we read the new policy, to provide materials that will enrich and support the curriculum and meet the personal needs of the users, taking into consideration their varied interests and abilities, we've taken out
Yeah, that shouldn't be truncated.
maturity levels and or age appropriateness.
Yep, got it. That should not be truncated, actually.
Because I think that's,
Yeah. Other feedback on the objectives?
So I'm on F, and I highlighted to place principle above personal opinion and reason above prejudice. That was also in the former language. I think I want clarity on what specifically that means for the school district. Placing principle above personal opinion and reason above prejudice. To me, again, all I'm hearing is something that can be completely different per individual, where, per family, per student. And so I just want to understand what that, we're talking under objections of selection for our libraries, for our media. to place principle above personal opinion and reason above prejudice. Like, what is the principle? And I know that that might be really sticky. It might be feeling like I'm kind of being really nitpicky. However, given our in our own district, the challenges that we're facing regarding our libraries, this is not something that is specific to Prior Lake Savage Area Schools. This is being seen across our country. I just want more clarity on what our principle is. You know, it's when you know, talking about all of the things we want the people coming here and the people that are here to be feeling confident of our principle.
Right. And so the essence and the spirit of the term principle here refers actually back to the original A or the original one. That's the principle that we're trying to drive. So that's what that references to. And in terms reason above prejudice, and again, want to be very careful with this term. Prejudice meaning my bias towards something, okay, favoring of something, and I have the ability to influence that favor. So we want to have reasoning, again, tied back to the original one, or A in this case, that is the reason and principle that we rest our material selections on, that I personally might not like author X because of so-and-so, but if it meets the level of A, then I should not exercise my power to allow my favor to bias the selections, etc.
Well, then maybe F could be combined into A, that it's not its own.
Okay.
That it's, you know, it just, there's a, where it continues on. Does that make sense?
And I also was going to add, and I wonder, because that statement is almost verbatim to what it was in the original policy, the former policy, and I can't help but wonder if that was also referring back to the purpose statement in the beginning of the original policy as well.
I think that A and F are different, because I mean, all of these are equal. So I don't necessarily agree with that, but I do agree with what you just said, that F is kind of dating back to the original purpose. It's just in a different place. Is that
Maybe a point of emphasis
right?
that isn't laid out in the former purpose.
So the objectives aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, but they are kind of a checklist for how to go about the rest of this.
Right.
And then I had a question about G. So to encourage lifelong learning through the use of library and media center. So again, if we're going back and looking at the title, possibly to
Broadening
be
that.
closer to the original,
Learning resources.
should that be broader?
Yeah. So but before we jump down to G, what I'm wondering is, sorry, Lisa, if I could just real quickly. So with the objectives here being kind of a how-to step, right? And that's what these objectives are for. This is mainly emphasizing the role of a staff member who may have purchasing power, if you will, or responsibility for these materials. The purpose is general in nature. If we go back to that original purpose that Dr. Edwards mentioned, I think I don't know if I would necessarily tie A and F together. I think we need to keep that clear, that my power as a staff member doesn't supersede the process of selections of material. And that let us think about how we give clearer reference to that purpose, okay?
The way you just said it makes sense.
Yeah. So this is recorded, right? I don't remember what I just said. So as I'm thinking aloud.
Yeah.
So that makes sense. And then to Director Atkinson's point, to encourage lifelong learning through the uses of learning resources, not contained to just a physical space. Got it.
Moving right along.
Thank you. Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Appreciate that feedback.
Well, I highlighted prior to pre-K through 12 criteria for selection. However, all instructional materials, both curricular and co-curricular, shall be subject to the reconsideration procedures of this policy. I was very appreciative of that, and I just wanted to say that. Going down into pre-K through 12 criteria for selection on letter D.
Director Bullion, sorry, 1 second. Before we move on to the pre-K-12, just want to check for understanding on, let's just kind of chunk it out section by section. Any other comments on responsibility for selection? A and B. Okay, so we'll go on to the pre-K-12. Oh, I'm sorry, Jess.
Sorry, on G, do we want to say learning resources, or do we want to stick with instructional materials? The verbiage the same?
Well, if we were going back to, I think we were keeping the title of learning resources.
Yep.
So we'll keep that
selection.
language consistent throughout.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, so we're good with responsibility for selection. Pre-K-12 criteria for selection section.
I had highlighted on letter D, be relevant to today's world. We're in a time where some feel that things such as history is trying to be erased. Many things are happening in today's world that people are not in agreement with. So when we use language such as be relevant to today's world, I just feel like that may cause concern, because as far as historical information, historical books and resources, I don't know. To me, I just felt like that could be a concern for some. Does that make sense? I mean, we're in a space where, like, whether it be military bases are being renamed, there's statues being taken down. There's just a lot of things happening in our world today that makes people fear history being erased. That may have nothing to do with what D says. But when we talk about being relevant to today's world, I feel like our today, in many people's views, is very different from even 5 years ago, and different in a way that causes concern, anxiety, stress, you know. And so I had a personal check over that.
No, I appreciate that, and if I can just maybe take a run at reflecting back what I'm hearing and maybe offering some context. So the intent of this statement was to ensure that learning resources are reflective of our times. So just going back to what you were saying, Director France, I may be wrong, but that community that you spoke of that didn't want folks reading about poverty probably is not so concerned about that in today's world, right? So let us not be held hostage by our past, but to what your point is, let us not be held hostage to our current reality. And so I think we need to be okay with a certain level of ambiguity here, because let's be honest, materials are produced in response to present day, right?
Yep.
And so we want to ensure that our students have access to relevant materials, learning resources. I would say both for present day and to help lead them into where they will grow into their futures, while simultaneously honoring literature of the past. So I think what we're trying to encompass here is that it is very relative. Some literature is timeless, as they say, right? Classics or whatever they might say. Some writing today can be very edgy. I'm just grasping at a term here that might be compared to classics, and everything in between. So perhaps there's a way, what we're trying to get to is that learning resource materials need to be relevant to the learners, to our learners, maybe, is more the spirit we were trying to capture with that statement.
Can I offer something? I think when we're reading this, because this stuck out to me too. And I feel like if we feel like we need to explain what these lines mean, then I think we may have missed the mark with the line item. Because I read this and I go, what about the history teachers? What about the social studies teachers? What about, I want to check out this biography of Eleanor Roosevelt, or whatever the case may be. I think, but how you just explained it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah,
and I
and
feel
that's
like
the last part of learning resources are relevant to our learners.
Yes.
I think it's something like that.
Something like that, because this line did kind of stick out and jolt me a little bit.
That's our learners I wonder if that's the replacement, relevant to our learners.
Yeah.
Because that's what we're trying to say.
That's what we're trying
If
to
I'm
get.
reading this quickly,
So,
and I'm going through this, so what the heck does that mean?
Could it be
type
as
of-
simple as that?
So I look at it from, when I saw that statement, I looked at it from a different perspective. A couple of different examples. Growing up, I used to read the encyclopedia a lot.
Britannica.
Yes.
All right.
I
Yep.
still have them.
In my encyclopedia, I wanted to join the military, looked at the U.S. Military Academy in West Point, and in my encyclopedia, it showed that West Point was for men only. No longer relevant. It wasn't even relevant at the time that I was looking at it. Look at the copyright. It's 1972. Things have changed. So things have shifted. Women are allowed to go into the military and serve. They can go to the military academy. It's open. So looking at it from that perspective, relevant to today's world, we need to update our materials to reflect that current reality. Also, Pluto was a planet.
Yep.
And for a while, it was no longer a planet. I was sad because I like Pluto. And then it became a planet again, and I don't know. It's controversial. But making sure that our materials that our learners are looking at to explore and look at future career opportunities or just
Updated.
explore, that they're updated and reflect
Yeah.
current reality of what's going on, aside from, history and the social strata that we're experiencing.
And that's why I wouldn't change this one. And the other thing that I'm kind of thinking as we're going through this, just like the objective selection, these are bullet points that are aggregated. When we take one out and only look at it individually without looking at all the points A through L, I've done my glasses, L,
Yes.
okay. Then we're actually not doing it service. So so when you say be relevant to today's world and H and referencing reputable reviews, in other words, we're not putting out, stuff that's, really, not coming into or encompassing all the different viewpoints, regardless of what it is, or something that, so you put all that together, and you include be relevant to today's world. I think it encapsulates what Enrique just said, what this whole thing is. So
I hear you. I can't dismiss Director Olsted's comment, though, we've probably looked at this one for the past 7 minutes. And it's a really short bullet.
No, I get it.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering, again, to the average public, right? How, because I think both of you are saying the same thing from a different vantage point, actually. And what's the succinct way of saying it? I don't know if we capture both of what you say in the current bullet. Even in context, I think it needs to speak to the learner, our student, somewhere, the relevance for our student.
But when we say pre-K through 12 criteria for selection, if we just add resource materials for our students or learners should at the beginning, because again, when that comment was made, everything here is for our learners, not just that one. So if we added that statement in, and when we look at this in aggregate,
I
that's.
got you.
Yeah.
So put that up into the preamble, so to speak.
Correct.
All right.
And
then that can stand.
Right, and the other thing is while I get it that we pick this one out, is there anything in this entire policy that isn't for our learners? I mean, that's just all I'm trying to say is that when we, when we want to give holistic viewpoints and we want critical thinking to occur to look at all points, are we doing this policy service by not looking at it as an aggregate and then coming back and making sure it says what we want to say, rather than picking out one line at a time? That was my point, kind of, with that. And like I said, when I made my point earlier, the problem was I didn't see that coming out of the entire policy as strong as it is in our mission statement there, and that's kind of the gist of it. So when you read through this, what is the impression that it leaves
Sure.
as a whole?
Sure. So in that last sentence of the opening paragraph, are you potentially suggesting that resource materials for our learners should, and then everything follows, and we kind of capture that? Okay.
Or even do it as we enhance the actual purpose statement, make it clear the scope of this applies to. So we don't have to pick each one out and go, where is this really applying?
Gotcha. Okay.
I have a comment or question. It's on B. Actually, I have one on B and I, but on B, consider reading abilities, social development, and target audience age through personalizing learning. And then over here, somewhere, we had it say, personal learning of the students from whom the materials are selected. So I guess what I'm trying to understand, and there's a lot of words here. Could we just say that must be appropriate for the grade level and the age group for which the materials are used and made available? Because I feel like there's a component here that's missing that talks about where is, and I know we've talked a lot about this, we talked about this in the committee, age appropriate. And I think, with even some of the speakers this evening and those books, if they're rated, I don't know what they're rated, but if they're rated, it's whatever, high school, and they're in our middle school, that's not age appropriate.
Sure.
Or if they're rated 18 plus, should they really even be in our high school? So I feel like there's something missing here that has to do with age appropriate materials for the age level and the grade level and the age group for which the materials are used and made available. And I don't know.
Can you say your suggestion again?
Yeah, so must be appropriate for the grade level and age group for which the materials are used or made available. And that's taken from another school district policy.
And I have a similar one in the former policy that maybe we should bring back, actually, because I
I
have
actually liked your former policy.
Number 4, number 4 in this section.
Yeah, I highlighted 4, look at that, I have it right there.
Maybe we need to bring that back in.
Yeah, so we can just replace,
Replace
replace
B with 4.
four.
Former 4.
Yeah, former 4.
4 is under
The
former
old
policy.
Under
the
which,
current policy, under
Same
same
criteria
section,
for selection of learning resources.
bullet number 4.
It reads, learning resources
Oh,
shall be
yes,
appropriate
got
for the
it.
subject area.
I think that speaks to Director Atkinson's point.
And for the age.
I think we said the same thing, we
Emotional
condensed it and it didn't come through as well, because we have target audience, age,
Yeah,
yeah, social
it fell
development.
off there.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then is there any way we could just say materials must be free of pornography? I mean, that's just like, we say it in our other policies, so tying back to, a student cannot come into our building carrying pornography. Teacher can't teach pornography. But if it's considered pornography, or has pornography in a book, and then how do we define pornography? I mean, there, you know, so I guess, you know, we must have a way of defining it in our other policies. Because I think we have it in 2 other policies. Oh, I'm just making a suggestion. If we were to write materials must be free of pornography. Like, we referenced that in 2 different policies. I can't remember, my computer died.
The tech policy.
Yeah, there's 2 other policies, that's 500 series and student conduct, actually.
Yeah, I think it's a discipline policy.
Yeah, student conduct says a student cannot have pornography. I have a, it just died. So, if we could maybe take, you know, look at that.
Okay.
Oh, sure, that'd be lovely.
And then we'll have that in the criteria for selection section.
Yeah, that it must be.
Language
Okay,
around that.
yep.
And then one other question about sorry. We reference reputable reviews. Is there any way to reference the vendors that we use? Or, you know, because there's so many different resources out there for selecting books. But I'm assuming there must be a list of databases.
there
Or are there
are-
just,
there-
are there millions?
There are millions.
Oh, okay, all right.
There, we have big go-tos
Mhm.
that the library media specialists and, the National Librarians Association, they have some of our bigger ones that we'll list out, but there are literally thousands.
I'm just thinking that if a book was brought forward, like some of the books we heard from earlier, if a parent could then go on there and go, whatever it may be, oh, that book is rated for 17 or 8, whatever. Oh, I guess it's okay for in our high school. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And would it take away some questions about?
Yeah,
Whether
I
it's
think we
appropriate
can,
or
I
not.
think we can, I'm sorry.
Well, I was gonna say, you know, the whole purpose of this, as the bottom, is to have a committee and to have individual materials actually submitted, just like before,
Well,
in a form.
twofold, actually.
Okay.
One is for ensuring, so our current resources haven't been vetted through a process that we are suggesting necessarily, okay? This is a new process, some new processes that we're adding and new layers of accountability that we'll be adding. And let me be clear, I'm not saying folks have been reckless or whatever, but that we have to do both anything that centers around an inquiry or a challenge, but also how do we take stock of our current inventory to ensure that what we have currently, because some of these books might have been purchased 20 years ago and never been checked out in, you know, like 10 years or whatever, you know, so we don't know, I mean, we have a digital library catalog, so how could we potentially run that Excel file through, you know, a series of our vendors to ensure, and I think to Director Atkinson's point, you know, if I'm at coffee and somebody says, oh, book so-and-so, you know, don't let your kid read that. And then I'm like, I wonder if we have that in my library, you know, and I wonder what that's about. And I can pull it up or I can run it through on my own if I wanted to.
That wasn't my
Oh, okay.
question. My
Sorry.
question was, we have a form here,
Right,
because that's what I was going for. The form is a little bit more, I would say, a little bit more open-ended, robust
Yeah,
on
it
the
is.
new one.
it is.
But we had a form before, and we're suggesting a committee, and then in the new policy is the vendor database. I wasn't questioning the vendor databases.
No, I think it's a, okay.
I think it was, you know, going back to, you know, the concept of somebody finds a book or something like that,
Yeah, yeah.
or a material.
Yep,
and doesn't like it, we have the statement of concern and the form already in place where anybody can go and fill this out.
Sure. Yep.
Already in place if they felt that something
Yes.
that was in
Right.
there was
Yes.
wrong.
Currently, we
Right.
have that.
Yes.
Yes.
So that piece didn't change.
There are
And-
some changes to that piece.
Well, no, I know
Became
there's
more-
changes to the form.
Oh,
Yes,
yeah.
but the
Yeah.
concept of having a form did
Was,
not change.
yeah,
Yeah.
was still there.
Correct.
Yep.
Correct.
And people could still fill this out
Yep.
and all that.
Yep.
So that didn't change. And now the form is gonna go through a committee?
Yes, which formerly was called out. but
Okay.
Not, to my knowledge, exercised very often.
Mhm.
And given that we may see it needing to be exercised, we have more prescriptive procedures around that.
Right.
That we also have developed.
Right.
So,
And this policy here, if I may continue, because again, I'm looking at it in aggregate, is kind of the guideline that the committee will go through with the same concepts of the form from before.
Mhm. Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
okay.
Yep.
That's, because, I mean, again, I'm not trying to, bully my way through this, but it's just like we're picking pieces out, and I'm looking at this in aggregate, and I think that without going through that form, and now the added benefit of the committee, what's gonna happen is we're gonna start to define these things more succinctly as we go through that process. So we're probably gonna see another version of this policy next year.
We very well
Yeah.
could, because this is going to be something that we know this is, top conversations in many communities. And like any new policy, after we go through a cycle of implementing that policy, we might see areas or holes that we missed this, or we need to tighten the definition of this, or whatnot. So yes, we definitely will go through that with this process. Because of the process, we're gonna learn so much as well through any kind of inquiry or challenge that comes through.
And that's kind of that's what I'm looking at this, and
Yeah.
instead of creating very prescriptive rules ahead of time, we have broad concepts in here. And granted, we did succinct it to the point where, obviously, if we're asking questions, then some things need to be spelled out a little bit more, but I would hope that with the objectives spelled out here, these objectives would then be applied and then refined.
Yes.
Okay, sorry, the way it was going on before, I was going, okay, that contradicted this, and why do we have this form and all that
Well,
good stuff.
we just want to have, again, this is your ability as a board. I mean, you own policy, and we
Right.
want to make sure that this first draft, albeit revised in the future at some point, is kind of starting on a platform that you all can stack hands on. So,
And then I have a question. In the original policy, there was a procedures for selection, and I don't see that in the second policy. So the procedures for selection was that someone professionally had to review it prior to purchase, and then using their judgment by either the teacher, the administrator, or the need professional.
Yeah, so
they're-
B
that-
in the
so
first
it's-
policy.
Well, it's C, actually.
Oh.
C, procedures for selection. In selecting resources, the
Yes.
licensed review personnel and consultant. Do you want me to read it?
Yep, no,
Oh.
I've got it right
Oh,
here
you
in
got it.
front of
Oh,
me.
okay,
Yep,
so
yep.
that section is not
Is
included
missed.
in here.
That's what I thought this whole thing was about, though. Each one of these objectives were kind of the spelled out checklist for that selection. I think that's where I'm confused.
Well, I think if you go back to, if an
Yeah, I think
item
the
needs
procedures.
to be
that-
reviewed, somebody actually needs to read them or preview it before they purchase it. That may have been not happening in the past if these questionable books got put into our library that aren't age appropriate. I think it's okay to just check a box and say, okay, I approve that one, but if you don't know if it's age appropriate or there's, content is questionable or whatever. well,
Yeah, I
Where's the
def-
accountability for
I
people who
definitely-
are approving the materials?
And I'm looking at currently, what we're proposing, it would go right above the process for deselection. Because I think that is a
Yes.
gap.
Yes, the process for
What I'm
selection and the
hearing-
process for deselection,
Yep,
correct.
what
That's,
I'm hearing
I
you
felt
say
the
is
same
there's a
way.
gap and we should bring back C
Yes,
from the former policy and put it right above process for deselection.
Correct.
correct.
I'm trying to follow that too, so.
And, well, yeah, and so under the heading pre-K-12 criteria for selection that's the selection in the current, or in the revised
Yeah.
policy. That's where C was inadvertently captured.
Yes.
And so it says to build a collection, that would be done by a teacher or a library media specialist, et cetera. That's written into that opening paragraph. It's not as explicit, so it's not called out in its own section.
Well, isn't it one, like K through 12 criteria for selection is more about the content? And then there's actually the actual procedure for selecting it. What the employee needs to do to select the materials. What are the steps they need to take to
Yeah.
safeguard that this material is appropriate to fit into
Gotcha,
the
yeah.
criteria for
Gotcha,
selection?
Gotcha. Fair push. So,
And I'm gonna ask a question on that because the procedure is usually after we do the
in
policy.
regulation, yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
and I didn't like the fact that we have procedures in some policies and not in others. We tend to do that all the time.
Yeah,
Read of this came to that.
yeah.
And we've had that inconsistency throughout a lot of our
Sure.
policies that we are trying to change and adapt to.
Yeah,
And
regulation.
I wondered if that was why
Yeah.
that was not in here, but I,
Mhm.
Yep, that was our original read on the first, on our current policy that's in
Right.
place. There was a lot of what appeared to be overlap. Policy and
Right,
procedure.
so then to that point, if we're going to, Vice Chair, stay consistent and cleaner in policy, then process for deselection, prior to the reconsideration process, I mean, a lot of this should be subordinated to regulation.
Yes, that's what, I mean, yeah.
Mhm.
Also, I would hope that the actual physical procedure would be much more detailed and verbose
Mhm.
in general
Yes.
than the governing concepts of
Document.
policy.
It is,
Yeah.
yeah, definitely. Okay. So with that caveat, we will go back to generally speaking, let's walk through this though, because we do want your input because of the sensitivity of this topic. I think it's important to have the conversation, albeit about regulation, but we'll make sure that we differentiate that when we have policy, bring it back as policy and then 606R or whatever.
An addendum or
Yeah,
attachment.
a procedural attachment. So we'll split it out, but we'll still keep in the spirit of the conversation for tonight. If that's okay. Okay.
That's fine, I'm sorry for being such a
No,
stickler on that.
I
but-
appreciate that. We talked about that as well, but we were just mindful of
Yeah,
how sensitive this one was, so.
and Amy, you were going through this, are you good with your questions too, and Jess, because I know that Liz highlighted.
Yep, my next comment comes in process for deselection.
Okay. So are you good with this?
I'm good, yeah,
Okay.
I might just have to use the restroom.
I do too. I do too, we need a break.
I texted Martha on the side, I said, am I allowed to go?
You are actually allowed to go.
I was counting board members, am I okay?
I am a little.
Okay, I'll go now, okay.
I'll go after you. Should we wait
Nora
for
said
them?
yes.
Should we wait for them to come back?
Do you want to share your thoughts on the process for deselection? Because again, I think the direction we're going with that is we're going to pull that and the process for selection from the former into a procedure appendix page.
Yeah.
But
You know,
what's your feedback on that?
My, well, I highlighted the last sentence. It should be understood that selection is an ongoing process, which will include removal, materials. I don't have to read that for you.
Yep.
This is more a comment and a question. Given the findings of questionable books in our district, what can our what can our community, what can we as a board, what can we expect as far as the examination? And like,
Yep.
what is reasonable for us to say, you know, we're gonna come back to the community, we've heard these concerns, and we're gonna come back and we're gonna address it. We're not gonna kind of just let it go away, right? Like that we know that this is a concern, and we are gonna take the actions needed to make our community feel that we've heard them and we've taken action. So I guess my question is, given our findings, what is the examination process gonna look like, and what is a reasonable timeline that we can say, you know, that we have addressed all of these concerns, and we can assure our community that as of, you know, the end of this school year, or, you know, as of June 1st, there's no pornographic materials in our schools. Like, I feel like I'm just curious, mostly as a parent, I just wanna, you know, how can we communicate that? What does that look like, and what's reasonable?
Well, to date, there has not been the existing form completed and turned into my office.
That was my question.
If
It's
a
been in
form,
policy for a
Yep.
while, yeah.
if a form is completed,
Yeah.
as the policy calls, there'll be a committee pulled together, and within that, there would be a report completed regarding the conclusion of that committee related to that resource. So that would be something that would be shared, the conclusion of that particular resource that was called into question.
So I respect the fact that you share no forms have been completed to date, because that's, I mean, but as a parent who may not just know to look to policy, look to form, and more just maybe the shock of what they found, the sensitive nature of what they found, the question really lies as far as our district and our staff members. How did they get here?
Yep.
You know, and so I feel like, you know, it would be reasonable to I think it would be a reasonable request to say, you know, we need to investigate, we need to do a thorough examination of our learning resources.
Yep.
And, you know.
Yeah, and what I would say also is and I'm gonna go back and look at the tape of tonight's, I jotted down 2 of the titles, not the third, but there are 2 titles that I think, despite the fact that a form has not been completed, require some review. And there was a title that was brought to our attention earlier this year.
Yes.
Did not have a form completed. We subjected it, which is why we added the segment to page 3, number 6, because our current policy does not allow for, you could argue, us to do what in fact we did, which was remove the resource from our selection.
Yeah.
So we added that. We are proposing to add that. And to the topic, and I think Dr. Thomas kind of kicked this off with I think there were titles that were brought forward this evening that need our similar consideration.
And I would just add that, first of all, we develop a process and a policy around that, which I appreciate. And we should be consistent with following that. And as we're going through the steps, if we find that, again, something else isn't defined well enough, you know, then we go back to the board and follow this procedure to make sure that that particular material did not meet the objectives. of our district, as well as of this policy, as well as the selection and deselection. But I would hope that when people do find something like that, that they do actually call the district. Because shock value is almost, by doing that, is almost as bad as the original content. We would hope that, and this policy has been out there for a while. Not in the format, in the other format. And because it's just as easy for someone to call up and do what they did, we don't want this book, we don't do this, all that. And we had a policy that wasn't as robust, or in some cases succinct as now, that they would actually do the right thing.
Sure.
And fill out the form from before.
Sure.
So that would be the expectation of the parents and the adults in our district.
And I think too, even before that, which I didn't even realize as a parent, prior to reconsideration process number 3, that you can put, if as a parent, you don't want your son or daughter or your student to read a book, you can put a note in their file, as it were, or they go to check out a book, and whether they know they're not, mom or dad or grandma and grandpa or whoever don't want them to read it, they go to check out, there's a note in their file that will not let them check it out.
And that's a procedure we have had in place, but we didn't have that noted in policy.
Right.
Right.
So I think that's important to point out too,
Yeah.
that
So that
is there.
So that policy, so that process is in place now, or no?
Yes.
It is
It's
in
here.
place, but it wasn't stated
But it
in
wasn't
policy.
It wasn't memorialized in this policy, but it's been there. The
Right.
form's been there, and a few other things have been there, so, and if you go to the district website, even before we redid it, and you search, it would come up. It would be one of the first search things
Oh, I
on there,
didn't
so.
realize that.
I would also suggest, so 2 things. We will have to conduct our own initial audit of materials, just whole scale. Okay, so that's something, that's an internal protocol that we're gonna have to do. We have thousands of materials, Director Gillian, so I don't want to pretend to know how long it would take to get through all of them, but I would imagine a quick pass with a digital Excel file to run through preferred vendors, clearinghouse or whatever, we might be able to start there to start doing a rough cut and then just get more granular as we get through to kind of establish, because what we heard tonight from our community, some of our community members, without knowing the whole book, if that context is the whole book, shouldn't be in our libraries. I don't think there's anyone here that will question that. And so, and I'm not gonna, I understand the understanding, like, well, how did it get here? Well, I don't know. I just don't. But what I do know is that I'm committed, and our staff are committed to ensuring that we don't repeat that, so that we don't have constant public comment about the kind of graphic content that we heard tonight. I think the second thing I'll say is the internal protocols, such as what Director Olstad just referenced again in terms of making requests as a parent, because once we do an audit and we're good, you still might object to something because of whatever reason for your family, okay? Whatever it might be. And boom, it's in the file, good to go. And we also have to keep in mind, at our middle school, we have varying developmental interests of our kids. And we also know that, and what I mean by that, to quote one of our media specialists, we have kids who are still playing with dolls and kids who are doing things that they really shouldn't be doing in middle school, right? So it's a varied range. And then we also know that at high school, we have 18-year-olds, right? Who could legally go see an R-rated movie and legally read an R-rated book, right? So how do we account for that? So what's our internal protocol for if such selections are available, and I use my library card, that I get buzzed because I'm under 18 and I'm not able to check that out. You know, or if I'm a sixth grader and this book is really gauged for eighth grade, I get buzzed because, oh, you're sixth grade, you're not eighth grade, right? Students in the same campus with varying ages and things of that nature. So I think there's some other nuances that we have to account for to bring protections into the system that may not exist today, you know, that we'll have to explore as well.
I have a suggestion. So, in Schoology, is it possible to put in a notification when a child checks out a book? Because there's a button for media specialist and there's all different kinds of different. Is it possible to put in there that, boom, my son or daughter checked out this book and there it is. It's sitting right there. So if a parent wants to, they can just go look.
Yeah.
Oh, these are the 6 books my kid has checked out.
Yeah.